Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Good morning, everyone. Before I begin, I'd like to also acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon which we gather, the Ngunnawal people. This land was stolen and never ceded. It was, it is, and always will be Aboriginal land. I feel incredibly privileged that we can gather here today. Today we come together to remember a dark period in Sikh history, one that continues to haunt the Sikh community 4 decades later. As I look around the room, there's a reason each and every one of us is here today. We've all felt the impact of those events in one way or another. Some of us witnessed them firsthand, others might have heard stories from our parents or our family members, and some of us, particularly those from my generation, may not have grown up with these stories due to the lasting intergenerational trauma that exists today, but have learned through our own research. Regardless, each and every one of us feels the impact of November 1984. So I encourage you all to approach today's discussion and what we hear from the speakers with an open mind. With limited information and resources, once restricted our understanding of what took place, we now have more access to information than ever before to evaluate what truly happened day by day. The violence that erupted against Sikhs in November 1984 was not a series of random attacks. It was an orchestrated attack marked by shocking brutality, not only in Delhi, but across India. And the wounds of the attack exist today. October 31st, 1984, India's Prime Minister, Indira Gandhi, is assassinated by her Sikh bodyguards in response to Operation Blue Star, a military action carried out earlier in the year. At 11 a.m., All India Radio announced that she'd been attacked by Sikh bodyguards and was taken to AIIMS Hospital. Crowds began gathering outside the hospital. And at 2 p.m., her death is officially announced. Anti-Sikh slogans, like blood for blood, echoed in the streets of Delhi. At 5:30 p.m., then Indian President Zahir Singh, a Sikh, is travelling to the hospital and his car is stormed by the mob gathered outside. It is on this day, October 31st, that the first Sikh is killed on the streets surrounding the hospital. As reported in Economic and Political Weekly in December 1984, the Delhi violence was well planned and well organised. It would have burst forth even if Indira Gandhi had been alive. Reports that have since emerged suggest that the violence had been premeditated, which potentially timed to coincide with Guru Nanak Dev Ji's Gurpurab on November 8th. The assassination only triggered what was already planned for later in the month. As violence spread, the national media played a disturbing role in fueling anger and spreading disinformation against Sikhs. False stories circulated that Sikhs had poisoned water supplies, were stockpiling weapons to attack non-Sikhs, and so forth. So much so that India's single national television channel, Doordarshan, ran a 15-minute segment panning between the footage of Indira Gandhi's body and mobs chanting anti-Sikh slogans. The disinformation campaign aimed to create hatred and instigate violence. Overnight meetings among government officials set the orchestrated plan in motion. On November 1st, 1984, eyewitness accounts and multiple reports describe government officials distributing resources, including flammable substances and weapons, and transporting mobs to targeted locations. As the day unfolded, these mobs were given voter lists, school records, and Gurdwara registers, or official government records, to identify each and every Sikh household and business in the area. They were cross-checking, cross-referencing each of these resources and began marking Sikh homes and businesses for attack. Throughout the day, Sikh men were targeted in their homes and workplaces, some burnt alive, others beaten to death. Entire families who lived in these neighbourhoods for generations were now marked for extermination. In one area in southwest Delhi, 21 women were widowed from a single extended family. One witness recounted a horrifying incident. Her father was injured, and she lied to the mob, saying he was dead. They left, but returned 6 times, and on the 7th return, they found he was, in fact, alive. They dragged him out of the home, beat him until his brains spilled out, doused him in petrol, and set him on fire. There is an intention here to maximize the suffering, and I want to highlight how organized this all is. Surveyors identified homes, transporters brought in and removed the attackers, and cleanup crews then disposed the bodies. This is not something that can be planned overnight. A powerful example on that day involves the area of Kadlokpuri. Around 156 in this area banded together to form a defensive group for the incoming mobs. Thousands of attackers descended on them, and after a 2-hour standoff, police arrived. They escorted the attackers away, but then came back to disarm the Sikhs with the various sticks and swords they had lying around the homes, and instructed them to go inside. The attackers then returned, and police blocked off the 2-lane area, sealing Sikhs inside. Over the next 30 hours, they massacred Sikhs with knives and cleavers, only pausing for meal breaks in between. 2 journalists came across this area the next day and found streets littered with body parts and charred remains of homes. Women and children were stripped naked and left in the streets, if not killed. Eyewitness senior journalist Rahul Bedi recalled that there were so many human remains in the streets, it was impossible to walk without stepping on corpses. And the only reason we know about Kadlokpuri and the horrific acts that occurred here was because these reporters got here on 2nd of November. The police officer, SHO of the area, complained, stating that he did not get the bodies cleared out quick enough. In other areas, the process was a lot more clinical and quicker. November 2nd, 1984, the violence escalated dramatically. Eyewitness reported police officers encouraging mobs to loot and kill as much as you want for 3 days. They had a timer until international media would start taking notice. Burn injured Sikhs were turned away from hospitals and denied treatment. Many Sikh women and children were dragged from their homes, stripped and sexually assaulted in broad daylight. Some who returned to the police for help found that they were complicit, either looking the other way or actively collaborating with the attackers. There were orders from higher up. One survivor, Lakshmi Kaur, described how her husband was burned alive in front of the police stations while officers stood by watching. When she attempted to pursue justice, she was threatened and ultimately forced to withdraw her case out of fear for her own safety. The violence was not only limited to individual homes, however. Sikh places of worship were also targeted. Gurdwaras, sacred spaces where Sikhs gather for prayer and for community. In Delhi alone, 330 Gurdwaras were burned and attacked by the mobs. Ex-Indian Army officer Captain Manmohan Bir Singh Talwar was surrounded in his home. This is an army officer that has devoted his whole life to protect the Indian state. When he attempted to defend himself and his family against the mob, they were able to escape. However, police would wrongfully arrest him for charges of murder later on. November 3rd, 1984. Violence continued, spreading to train stations, streets, near neighbourhood areas. Witnesses spoke of Sikh passengers being pulled from trains and killed on the spot. The violence was now being reported in multiple cities, and it has become clear that this is not a spontaneous reaction, but a coordinated assault on the Sikh community and Sikh identity across India. In the map on the screen, you can see all the cities where attacks were reported across India. In Bihar, a young girl reported seeing a mob dragging out her parents and 3 brothers as she watched as they were killed one by one from a nearby neighbour's house. In Madhya Pradesh, a Sikh man faced with an overpowering mob was left with the agonising choice to take his own and his family's life to spare them from the incoming mob. This tragic act of desperation highlights the sheer hopelessness faced by many Sikh families during this day. November 4th, 1984. The Indian Army was finally deployed. However, by then, much of the damage had already occurred. Entire neighbourhoods lay in ruins, and the Sikh community was left up to pick up the pieces of shattered lives. Thousands of Sikhs were now homeless. Thousands of Sikhs were now homeless, taking refuge in makeshift camps with little or no government support. Those who survived faced not only the loss of their loved ones, but also the trauma of having been targeted by the very government and society that they once trusted and lived amongst. Refugee camps began to spring up across Delhi, with approximately 50,000 refugees in Delhi alone. That is 50,000 individuals that all had lost one or multiple family members. The aftermath brought further hardship. The authorities cut off water supplies to these refugee camps, aiming to disperse the survivors and make the camps less visible to journalists. Many survivors were forced to return to their homes, or at least what was left of their homes, because the camps were proof that something had occurred. The government of India states that figures for Delhi alone sit at just under 3,000 deaths in the 3 days. However, human rights groups dispute this. We've got no medical records, no admitting of any patients, fire engines were refusing to go put out fires where there were burning bodies. There has been a massive cover-up of disposing of these bodies. There's no post-mortems. And journalists have reported seeing markets of dead bodies and trucks being loaded. One journalist counted 119 bodies in a single truck, and there's eyewitness accounts of hundreds of these trucks. So, estimates now sit at around 30,000 Sikhs that were killed. However, the true figure is likely to be much higher. Remember, there were 50,000 refugees that had lost a single or multiple family member in Delhi alone. When asked about the violence, India's newly appointed Prime Minister responded, in his infamous words, "When a big tree falls, it is natural for the earth to shake a little," to describe what had occurred in his capital city over the 3 days. Meanwhile, orphan children were being given to Christian missionaries, raising ties to their Sikh heritage. Delhi is one place in the world where there is a widow colony of more than 3,000 widows from the anti-Sikh violence that occurred over these days. In the 40 years, no police officer has been convicted for their acts or their omission of acts. Those that have been convicted have served little time or been convicted towards the end of their life. Not a single conviction has occurred for the rape or sexual violence that occurred in the streets of Delhi. Not a single one. As we remember these events today, we must ensure they're recognised, understood, and prevented from happening in the future. So, I call upon you, as we reflect on what occurred in November 1984, seek out the accounts of survivors, educate others about the realities, and ensure that the truth is not buried under layers of political propaganda or historical amnesia. Thank you. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.